Hey Terry, thanks for sharing this last night with everybody. I wanted to give you some constructive feedback and reactions. And so I think the first question for me is, obviously we need a new LUMAscape in the sense that advertising and marketing are changing very quickly thanks to AI. And to me, the two dynamics here are AI as a surface, meaning like people are spending a ton of time on ChatGPT. How does that change how we reach people? And I think that's where you're going with this here, which is, maybe how do we understand the impact of AI as a surface? And then I think what you're saying here is the other side of this is how does AI change the way we transact media? So what you're calling media facilitation is like how do we connect effectively advertisers to publishers and content owners. And I do think there's a lot of opportunities to change and evolve this. And then this is, customer experience, I think is traditional MarTech. And I'm not totally sure. I guess my question is, how different is this really in an AI world? I mean, I know all these companies have AI strategies, but like if you take just as an example, I don't know, any of these things 2 or 3 years ago, I'd be actually curious to see a version of LUMAscape where, like, if you said customer experience, how many of these companies are fundamentally impossible in the world of AI? Like, which could you simply not do without AI, and which are simply, better with AI, I guess. And I think you can see this here where, media optimization, this is basically just, I call this the ad network space to some extent of companies that are basically helping transact media. And whether that's, sort of this like classic ad tech stuff, most of these companies were either possible or effectively identical 2 or 3 years ago, which is fine. I mean, look, if we say AI is a revolution, well, where's the revolution? I guess that's my question, is which of these are totally, completely distinct? Another interesting point, at least unless I'm missing it, is I see, for instance, Horizon here, and they're doing awesome things in the AI world, but I don't see the other agencies and holding companies. I know you have, for instance, InfoSum being bought by WPP Media, which is great. What I'm curious about, though, is if you think about there's a whole layer of media that I think is just missing around, kind of let's call it the brand agent or the orchestration. Like what most agencies are trying to solve for is how do you connect the pieces between, the planning, audience configuration, activation, measurement, like that kind of cycle that is what every agency does every single day. I see measurement, I see audience. I just feel like there's just a kind of a orchestration versus activation bit here that's missing. And I look at this intelligence. I think these are all sort of, well, I have different thoughts about scope 3 in this context with things like AdCP, where I just don't feel like scope 3 solves the same problem. But this isn't about scope 3. This is about almost a different way of thinking about the problem set, which is this is all kind of a box that's missing. There's something missing up here. This is like we need to squish this box down to like ways of spending money. And there's a lot of stuff here, and you can do it through, curation, programmatic. You can do it through social, all this stuff. But this box for a lot of marketers is a very small box. Of course, if you're an ad tech, it's like the biggest box in the world. And this is almost like legacy LUMAscape box. I think it's really important to have data here. Some of this, though, going back to that point, like Akio, sorry. If you think about this as a way to make it really easy to write sort of SQL queries and build workflows, this is much to me where that layer is missing of how do we think about, let's say analytics or activation in this context. I think Newton also would not put themselves, they're definitely an analytics data science company, but I kind of think they're more like, if you said data enablement, or they're like kind of like the core job of, how do we think about planning and executing media. So I would just really encourage this to be maybe reconfigured. I just took a crack at what that framework might look like, and this is borrowed heavily from thinking by people like Tom Triscari on like the job to be done, and mine isn't as pretty. But if you sort of think about like this in a framework of like, what am I selling? Who is my customer? How do I reach them? Right? That's kind of the job of marketing. This whole world of data, like if you think of CRM, whether that's Databricks, Snowflake, Salesforce, HubSpot, myriad companies who are just basically trying to help everybody who's a CDP, LiveRamp here, of course, if you start thinking of activation, there's this deep connection to this data. This is probably a one-way arrow, but there's this learning about customers. And if you go to my big question, which is how does AI change each boxes, who is my customer is not going to be who comes to my website necessarily, because that may be an agent. If you think of agentic commerce, there's a totally different set of data coming here. And I'm actually fascinated by, as an example, like how do we, what's an agent ID? An agent ID graph, basically. Like how can I map agents to my humans? Like that's an interesting question, right? Well, I don't have any idea, to tell you the truth, but that would also be an activation question over here. So I feel like, just to give you the concrete feedback, you're missing white space. Your LUMAscape needs a lot of white space because it needs to reflect the fact that we don't even know the problems yet. We haven't even found the right problem set. And I would say leaving white space, and of course you'll expand and grow the thing, I would say, I think my recommendation would be any business that kind of looks the same as it did 5 years ago or fills the same box, you can almost compress. So going to my sort of framework here, like content and creative, how do I reach my customers? Well, content and creative is the most important thing. This goes back to what am I selling? Who are my customers? The lines between content and creative seem very blurred to me in the sense that, it was very distinct, like organic was my website, and people are going to come to my website and they'll see my messages, and then, I'll show them ads and they'll be funny or serious, and creative's this way and content's that way. I think my hypothesis is a lot of this is blurring. And, if you go back to AI as a surface, or AI as a commerce mechanism, there's like this really interesting question of like AI as a medium versus AI as a shopping assistant, like, whoa, I can't even type. Like this to me is like really impactful to how we think about all of this stuff. We really have to think about this. And just going back to the LUMAscape, commerce is not here enough. And there's a fundamental change of commerce happening. So if you look at like a Criteo and you're like, well, what's Criteo up to? I think they're trying to figure out how to facilitate commerce in this next cycle. And I'd be curious how many companies here are actively thinking about that. Obviously Sky, PackView, very much in the retail context. Where's retail media here? There's a ton of innovation happening. And I know you can't put everything on here, but if the whole idea of retail media is monetize the human eyeballs that come to your website and stores, that's going to be disrupted. And I think figuring out how to help, like even loyalty programs in that context, like there might be a huge asset there if you think about agentic commerce or ACP, which is like the agentic commerce protocol. Like that identification may actually just expand. Maybe that puts people like PayPal in an amazing space to go win. Again, I don't know that you'd put PayPal here because of their AI stuff yet, but I also just feel like you have to have more space, not just for the answers economy, but for the agentic commerce future, because that's where we're going to go see opportunities. And, ad tech and services, I don't think you have enough of the services. Services are going to get totally disrupted, I think, by a lot of the agentic workflows. And yet the companies that are most focused on this are, of course, services companies. So if you look at the WPP investments in AI, or you look at how Publicis is doing core AI, or how look at Omnicom working on Omni AI. These companies are very aware that they have to be the leaders in this transition. And the vast majority of these companies are vendors to the agencies. Some will be vendors directly to the marketer. But I'm concerned that we're just not thinking enough about media facilitation through the eyes of the folks that do the vast majority of that. And if you think it's going to be disrupted, cool. But where are the disruptors? Where's the folks that are basically saying, agents are going to do media? I mean, it's not that agency is fine, but I don't even see the right category here. So I would just say, summarizing my feedback, MarTech probably is largely out of scope if I were doing this, because I would just say, you're going to need an AI MarTech LUMAscape, or something like this. I think creative is really interesting in the context of paid because it sits here. And so if you were to sort of say, I'm going to focus on the universe that the original, LUMAscape did, cool. But I want to talk about where AI is disrupting that, like the disruption of the web, right? Because that's where AI as a medium is eating the web as a medium. And if you look at the original LUMAscape, it was about web, because that's all we had. Well, today, that's going somewhere else. And I think that's the interesting question is, if you're anywhere in this set of services and capabilities, where do you end up in 5 years? And because, Terry, I'm here to help, if I were trying to get people bought, I would think of anybody who's not necessarily AI forward or AI first as being a very logical acquirer for folks who are. So I wonder if this is actually a picture of the acquirers. And the question really becomes, as an angel investor, as a founder, like, where's the white space, the new categories that are going to get created? Like, the brilliance of the original LUMAscape is you came up with a new thing, the DSP, the SSP. I mean, you didn't invent those acronyms, but you said DSPs are a thing. Where is the equivalent of the DSP here? Where is the I need one of those, or this is how the world works? I don't think this is different enough from the way things are today. And I don't think it draws hard enough lines between some of the fundamental kinds of companies that the market needs. And so I would strongly suggest a much simpler, smaller version of this that is very much around those archetypal or sort of foundational ways of thinking about this flow here. What is going to happen to this flow? And maybe you add in this as a media company, to my point about AI as a medium, actually that's here, right? Is AI as a medium ends up on the right. This has to be addressed. This has to be one of the foundational things this answers. And then, sort of AI as a shopper, well, what the hell does this mean for paid ads, right? Because do you advertise to AI? I don't think we know. But to me, this is the fundamental area that needs the focus and thought. This is where I think we're going to see tens of billions of dollars of opportunity for anybody who can figure it out. And I think also that where I'm really fascinated is some of the new loops. So right now we're talking about who my customer is, what am I selling, right? But there's always like this sort of arrow back, right? Because I'm learning from this stuff. One thing that John Heller and Michael Rubenstein at firsthand have been very articulate about, which I think is really fascinating, is that this loop of how do I go back this way, this is something that brands are really curious about, is, in a world where AI as a medium gives me all of this insight into who is my customer, right? This starts getting really interesting from a fundamental company perspective of how fast can we iterate. I think we've all seen these cases, like Amazon, sees a bunch of customers buying something, they go out and like, oh yeah, we're gonna white label that. Like we can do that too. We can have cheaper whatever. That's one version of that. I think the more nuanced version is, everybody keeps saying, well, I really want a 3-door electric SUV that fits in my garage. And, if you ask any major car brand, they'll be like, nope. But, why is that nope? Why isn't it that, that's going right back to who is my customer? Well, who is not my customer? I'm not your customer because my garage can't fit your SUV in it. Well, this is maybe a way to expand the opportunity and the TAM. And I think that's really fascinating. So that's sort of that new imagination of how marketing could work or will work in a future with agents. And I think there's a really, really fascinating story here that I think you could tell to some of your M&A clients and to help them understand that anything that's going to change fundamentally and in the AI world is an opportunity for certainly the MarTech ecosystem, but for marketeurs and for some of the companies that want to lead in that space, they're going to figure this out and say, well, I want to know about the implications to